On September 9th, 1999, Sega released its final piece of gaming hardware, the Dreamcast. Like a shooting star, the Dreamcast burned hot, it burned bright, and it burned out too fast. Thought to be Sega's salvation following the dismal performance of the Saturn, the Dreamcast was developed and aimed squarely at the dedicated gamer. But while Sega did so much right, so much more went wrong. For the next few minutes, let IGN take you through the whirlwind, exuberant, but ultimately tragic 2-year life of the Dreamcast. In 1997, battered and bruised by the arrival and subsequent dominance of the Sony PlayStation, Sega knew it needed a head start on the next generation of hardware if it wanted a chance to succeed. And so the company pulled the plug on the flailing Saturn to not only free up resources needed to develop and launch its new machine, but to finally bury its compound mistakes with the ill-fated console.
I was a diehard fan of the Saturn, and now I can look back on it and realize it was a disaster.
It had very little third-party support. Now, there is a main reason for this. Imagine you're at E3, where all the big announcements happen, and they announce the Saturn, and they announce the release date, and surprise to everyone there, the release date is immediate. Right there, Sega made a huge mistake in that they jumped the gun and got their hardware on the shelf, but they left all the third-party support behind, and they were never really forgiven for that when the Dreamcast came out later.
But the development of the new machine was about as simple as the chip architecture of the Saturn. Dual designs competed within Sega to become the Dreamcast, with a Hitachi-designed processor and PowerVR2 graphics chip nicknamed Katana besting a Voodoo 3D FX-powered machine codenamed Dural. Once the design was set, though, Sega went all out creating the games for the Dreamcast that it neglected for the Saturn, such as a Sonic the Hedgehog launch title named Sonic Adventure, which set tongues wagging.
This was going to be the big Sega console that did it right, you know? This was the future, this was next gen, this was all the little taglines you hear in ads, and this was going to be awesome.
I kept from getting laid in order to pick up a Dreamcast on launch day and get myself some Soul Calibur and Sonic Adventure. I couldn't resist.
The North American launch of the Dreamcast was an unmitigated success. Within 24 hours, Dreamcast hardware and software sales had topped $98 million, the best launch day of any console up to that point. The success was bolstered by a launch lineup that included striking games like Sonic Adventure, Power Stone, House of the Dead 2, and Namco's unbelievable Soul Calibur. It seemed every third party that Sega had spurned with the Saturn debacle was now on board, save for one very notable name, Electronic Arts.
The main thing about the Dreamcast third-party support is that it wasn't that good, first of all, but if you really had to pinpoint what wasn't that good about it, you'd have to go to EA.
So not having EA Sports on Dreamcast was obviously a huge deal, but not having any of the EA titles was a big hurdle, and the fact that you had this major company out there that said, yeah, we don't think the Dreamcast is going to last, it sort of created a psychological damage for the Dreamcast. It sort of set it out to say, this is going to fail, and we're the ones who know better.
But even with the absence of Electronic Arts, Sega had a stable of big names and big games for the Dreamcast from publishers like Midway, Capcom, and Namco. Sega's arcade heritage resulted in games like Samba de Amigo and Crazy Taxi, but it was Sega's quirky sense of innovation that resulted in fresh titles like Space Channel 5, Jet Grind Radio, and The Talking Fish Seaman. These were games you could not help but talk about.
It's sort of like the ultimate hardcore gamer's dilemma, where you know that this product's awesome, but you also know in the back of your mind that not really anybody's going to agree with you that it's awesome, and there's just going to be this tiny, tiny segment of the population that appreciates what these games are and how cool they are, but nobody's really ever going to play them. If there's one thing that's kind of sad about Dreamcast, it's that it never really attained the mass market appeal that maybe it could have. Maybe if it had made some different decisions in the type of games that were released, or maybe if it just was a little bit more mainstream.
They actually had a lot of games that appealed to Japanese gamers, but they wouldn't catch on to a broad audience. And you can see that in something like Space Channel 5, or certainly Seaman.
Well, Seaman didn't sell well because it had probably the worst name any video game has ever had, and it also was the weirdest game that you could imagine. It was like a virtual pet, except it was a fish with a head on it, and he talked to you, but he didn't just talk to you, he was a jerk. He was a total asshole.
And then there was Shenmue. Now, Shenmue is a game that had a whole lot of hype behind it. It's a game reportedly that cost $80 million to make, which even by today's standards is ridiculous, but for back then, I mean, it was easily the most expensive game ever produced.
Shenmue pretty much bankrupted Sega. That was like the nail in the coffin.
It was promised to be this game that made you feel like you were living somebody's life. And I guess if you live the life of somebody who just opened a bunch of drawers all the time, then yes, you in fact were living somebody's life. Somebody's incredibly boring life.
The hype leading up to the launch of the PlayStation 2 played an undeniable role in the fizzling of the Dreamcast. Early footage of Tekken and Ridge Racer looked excellent, and the PS2 promised Madden. But to top things off, every PS2 was also a DVD player. But it wasn't just the PS2 that was hurting the Dreamcast. Sega also had to defend itself against not only its oldest nemesis, Nintendo and the GameCube, but also an industry newcomer, Microsoft's Xbox. It was all too much. And so on January 31st, 2001, Sega announced that the dream was dead. By March, the Dreamcast would be completely out of production. Sega was not only out of the hardware game for this generation, but entirely. The story of the Dreamcast is bittersweet. It's a story of bright beginnings and tragic endings, of Soul Calibur and Shenmue. But what it's not, though, is a story of blame. No one group is responsible for the sad fate of the Dreamcast. Not indifferent gamers, not publishers that withheld their support. Everybody has a little blood on their hands. And so, 10 years out, IGN remembers the Dreamcast with a mixture of fondness, bewilderment, and reverence. The Dreamcast may be dead, but the dreams and memories it inspired in gamers around the world will live on forever.